Hello, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Planning for Your Microsoft Dynamics GP Year End. We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us today. There are a couple of housekeeping items we'd like to cover before we begin. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please either raise your hand and we can unmute your line, or submit them through the GoToWebinar question box. We'll be answering questions throughout, as well as saving time at the end for any additional questions. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We have Jeff Smith, who's a solutions architect here at Socius. For over 20 years, Jeff has specialized in project management, product engineering, and consulting for Microsoft Dynamics solutions. So at this point, Jeff, I believe we're ready to transition over to you.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thanks to all of you that are attending today. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and we feel that this is an important event because this is the thing you only do once a year, and so if you're anything like me, if you do it once a year, you don't remember by the time the next year rolls around. And really what we're going to talk about is, as much as what are the steps inside the software to close your year, is how you should prepare. So I want to make sure that you're aware of that. We'll make sure we go through this as thoroughly as we can. We have the next hour to cover that. And I also just wanted to, for any of you that may be on the line that are interested in payroll year end, we're not going to be covering payroll today as we had a session yesterday on payroll, but if any of you weren't able to attend yesterday but need some additional information about that, we have a recording as well as a slide presentation that we did, and we can make that available to you. All you need to do is ask. All right, so our agenda today, first we're going to attack a couple goals. We're going to review the common year-end processes, and along the way we'll provide tips and tricks for preparing for your year-end. There is a number of different modular year-end checklists, and we're going to provide an overview of that, but as we go through those we'll comment and give you some tips and tricks as we go through it. And then also what we think makes it a little bit easier to understand is also to step through the windows inside of GP. So we will show you a number of the windows that are applicable for what we're discussing in this year-end process. So first I wanted to start off with some recommendations, and many of these are common sense, but we want to make sure that you're comfortable with them. So first of all, because you do this once a year, if you have questions, it's very important that you use your resources. Don't be afraid to ask before you do. And so some of the resources that are commonly available are Customer Source. Many of you probably already have access to Customer Source. In a minute I'll talk about some Knowledgebase articles that are available on Customer Source that you can use that actually define the checklist that I'm going to be going through today. Also, if you run into a question, you certainly can always go to the Microsoft Dynamics GP Solutions Support team, or you can reach out to Socius, and our client care team would be glad to help you with any questions you may have as well. Probably as important as anything, and it's good because all of you are sitting in here, so you're trying to be prepared, but make sure you're prepared. So make sure all of your day-to-day activities are completed. We'll talk about what those activities are as we go through, but it is important to make sure that you have your ducks in a row before you go into the actual closing process. Also, just be methodical. Review and follow these year-end checklists. This slide deck will be available to you today, so you'll be able to use it as a resource as well as a variety of other things. One of the things that's important also is if any of you are using ISV or what we may call third-party applications, just make sure that those are compliant or compatible with the process. And you're going to hear me say this a lot, but I want you to make sure that you make backups appropriately as well as you do these processes. And some of the year-end closes are very short and simple processes, and some are actually a little bit more dramatic in the work that they do. And so but we feel it's very important to make sure that you make those backups and eliminate as much risk as you possibly can. There are a few other resources outside the norm of what I've mentioned already. So if any of you are members of GPUG, the GP Users Group community, you certainly have some information that you can garner out on the GPUG website, as you can see here. There are some other websites that are out there that might be useful for you as well if you have questions. So one is called gpwindow.com. And gpwindow.com has contributions from a number of resources, but basically has a variety of topics that you can certainly go out and look at, and year-end closing may be part of that as well. There's a MVP, a Dynamics Partner MVP, which just means that is a person that contributes to the community greatly. The lady named Victoria Uden that has a website that also has some references. And then lastly, there's a site called dynamicaccounting.com. So feel free to use those resources as well. We certainly want to make sure that you have a variety of different ways of attacking your questions. I'm sure that this is not a full list of options, but certainly wanted to make sure you knew of at least these. All right, as we go through, as I mentioned, there are going to be knowledge-based articles that are out on Customer Source. And so what I thought might be useful is to give you the knowledge-based article numbers that you can search for when you're out on Customer Source. So we're going to cover a variety of modules today, including the ones listed here. So if you're going to be closing your inventory, that is Article 872713. The Receivables module is 857444. Payables is 875169. Fixed Assets is 865653. Analytical Accounting, for any of you that use that module, is 960356. And then lastly, General Ledger is 888003. Now, these numbers have stayed consistent throughout the years. They get updated as we approach year-end each year to make them compliant with the latest versions of the software. And while the year-end process hasn't changed dramatically, it has changed in certain places, and certainly we want to make sure that you're aware of those. There may be some related knowledge-based articles as well on when people have errors or difficulties that, how to attack those. But these are the key knowledge-based articles that you're going to want to leverage when you're approaching your year-end based upon the modules that you're using in your organization. So again, I just want to kind of talk about this at a high level. It's really important to finalize any and all applicable transactions. Also reconciling your subledgers to the general ledger to make sure that you're in balance. And as we go through this process, we'll talk about how general ledger, the year end for general ledger is a far different process, and the timing on it is different than all of the other modules. So making sure that you reconcile your submodules can be very important in this process as well. Also going into the process, make sure you print any necessary reports and file those away. Make a backup when you're finished. That also will get you ready and prepared for beginning the year-end closing process. So if you have a pre-year-end close backup, then if something goes astray, you'll certainly have the ability to go right back to where you were. All right, so one of the things that we're going to talk about as we go through this is closing fiscal periods. And we're going to really kind of talk to this in each of the individual modules. So I thought rather than going back to this window 6 times, I thought I would just actually show it once. This window is the fiscal period setup window. And as we go into the year-end closing process, it's really important to have the year set up for the following year once we've closed and we can move forward. And so this window you can reach through the following path of administration, set up company and fiscal periods. And this allows you to, first of all, set up the new year. So in your case, setting up 2016 if you're on a calendar year. We will make reference to the differentiation between a fiscal year and a calendar year here too. In some modules it doesn't matter, in some it does, and we'll talk about that. So the other thing that we will talk about is once we have those years set up, we have the ability to close the individual periods. So you'll notice, for instance, if I use the Payables module, then I can close the individual periods for as I go through the year. And oftentimes what is recommended is at the end of the year, once you've closed your year, then make sure that all of these periods are closed as well. So keep that in mind. I didn't want to go back through that screen several times. Just make reference of it. You'll have this in the slide deck as you get that. All right, so the modules that we're going to cover should be closed in this order. Now, not all of you are using all of these modules, but certainly be aware that if you have them all, this is the order for which we would recommend you do them. There are two modules in this list that don't officially have a year-end closing process, but there's some considerations that you need to be aware of as you prepare for your year-end close, and so we'll talk to that. And really what I'm talking about there, actually there's three modules. That would be the sales order processing, the purchase order processing, and the analytical accounting modules. So while those modules don't have an official year-end closing process, there are some tasks that you want to make sure you get done before you close the other modules. And so follow this order. We're going to start with sales order processing and purchase order processing. And so, like I said, with sales order processing and purchase order processing, there really is no specific year-end close process in either of these modules. However, as you prepare to close inventory, it's important to make sure that you double check for any applicable invoices or returns and make sure they're posted in sales order processing. Also make sure that in the purchase order module you also double check for any applicable receivers or invoice match transactions and make sure that those are posted. And then lastly, there is a report inside the purchase order module called received but not received/not invoiced report, and this report should tie out to your accrued purchases liability account, and so you can get to that report through purchasing reports, purchasing analysis, and received not invoiced. So use that path to get to that report. So again, really all this is saying is let's make sure that if there are any invoices that are going to affect our payables module, our receivables module, or our inventory module, let's make sure those are all posted as they should be before we go into the actual year-end closing process. Okay, let's move on. The next module that I wanted to talk about was inventory. And so first of all, the inventory module should be closed at the end of your fiscal year before any new transactions that would affect inventory quantities are posted. And the reason that that it's important to do this is there are a number of summary numbers that are actually stored inside of Dynamics GP that we want to make sure are accurate for the year for which we're working. So the inventory module just has 1 year in close. It just has a fiscal year in close. So whatever that is, whether your fiscal year is your calendar year or whether you're on a July 1 to June 30 or any combination of dates, just be aware that the inventory module should be closed at the end of that fiscal year before any new transactions that would affect inventory quantities are posted. So why are we saying that? Well, it's because of what the inventory closing process does. It transfers all summarized current year quantity, cost, and sales amounts to last year for the items for which you have been keeping summarized sales history. Also, it updates each item's beginning quantity from the quantity on hand at each site. So if you're a single site or multi-site, it's going to update the beginning quantity on hand. And it's also going to zero out the quantity sold field in the item quantities maintenance window, which you can reach by going to inventory, cards, and quantities and sites for each site. Okay, so there are numbers that are tracked on a year-to-date basis, and really the idea here is that the inventory year-end closing process will move those out of the current year. Okay, so there's a zero out process and a new beginning quantity being brought forward in inventory. So there are some options when you close the year, and these are things that you'll need to keep in mind as you're going through that process. You have the ability to remove discontinued items. You have the ability to remove sold receipts. So there is a purchase receipts report inside of GP where that's tracked, and it can show you how many you've received and how many of those have been sold. You can also remove sold lot attributes and cost change history. So if you're tracking lots inside of your inventory, which is common in a number of different industries such as food and beverage, or a lot of times perishable items, so the idea would be that you can remove that history and those lot attributes as you close your year. That's optional. And then also, if you're using a FIFO or LIFO periodic costing methods, then the system can actually update the item's standard cost as well. These are all four options, and they'll be on the window that we'll look at here in a moment. So when you're closing your year, you can make decisions to yes or no to any of these items. All right, so when you're preparing for the inventory year-end close, what you want to make sure you do is post all your transactions for the year, reconcile inventory quantities, and there's two different ways to do that. One of those is actually a reconcile process inside of Dynamics GP inventory, and then the other one is part of the professional service tools library, but that reconcile process should be done. Most people who are maintaining an inventory at least do an annual inventory count, and that oftentimes is handled right at your year end. And so you can complete a fiscal inventory count and then post any adjustments that come from that fiscal count. So there are cycle count functionality inside of GP to allow you to make sure that your count is making the proper adjustments. Any additional reports that you use out of inventory, whether that be inventory turns, whether that be stock status reports and so forth, should be printed out at that time. And then at that time, when you've done all of that, you now are prepared to do your year-end close. And so in that situation, you should be able to make your backup and then close the year. Okay, now an optional step thereafter, like I mentioned a little bit ago, is then to close the fiscal periods for the inventory series and then make a final backup. So really what you're going to have is you're going to have a pre-close and a post-close backup for your inventory. And that'll be true as we go through all of these different modules. So just to show you the windows that we were referring to, this is actually the inventory year-end closing window. And so you'll notice that you have a variety of items that you can remove. Our discontinued items, our sold lot attributes, and our sold receipts and cost change history prior to a certain date. And then lastly, updating the standard cost. So these options, you can close your year without checking any of these, so it really depends on how you maintain your inventory. If you're using FIFO or LIFO perpetual, or if you're using weighted average or average cost, then the item standard cost you would never check that. So just keep that in mind as you go into that year-end closing process. So, Cheryl, I'd like to take a minute before we go too much further and just see if anybody has any questions on the distribution close part of Dynamics GP.
Okay, look through the list real quick here. I don't think that we do have any questions right now, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. All right, so now we're going to move on into a little bit more into the accounting process. And so the next modules I'm going to cover are receivables, payables, and fixed assets. So we'll start with the receivables module. And receivables, and this is also true for payables, there are two different close processes that are available. There's a calendar year-end close, and there is a fiscal year-end close. So what I wanted to talk about first is what each close does, and then I'll show you some screens and we'll talk about everything. So first of all, the calendar year-end close should be done at the end of the calendar year prior to posting any transactions in the next calendar year. Okay, so the calendar year, and we'll talk about what that year-end close does versus the fiscal year. So the fiscal year-end close should be done at the end of the fiscal year prior to posting any transactions in the next fiscal year. So like I said in the example of I have a 7/1 to 6/30 year, then I would actually do 2 year-end closing processes. Now, let's get into what they do. So the fiscal year-end close transfers all amounts other than the calendar year-to-date finance charge amount to the last year column in the customer summary using the amount since last closed view. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail and show you that screen in a little bit. In fact, here just in a moment. But to get to that window, you can go to Sales, Cards, and Summary. Now, by the way, I'm assuming that most of you are on either GP 2013 or GP 2015. These paths also would apply to GP 2010 if any of you are still using GP 2010. If you're on older versions, I'm assuming that we're using the menu bar on the bottom left of your window when you're in GP versus using the menu across the top. All right, so then the calendar year-end close transfers the calendar year-to-date finance charge amount to the last year column in the customer summary using the amount since last closed view, same view. So one bullet point here that I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of is if the amounts are incorrect in the amount since last closed view, contact support for scripts that can be ran to correct those amounts. Okay, so there are ways of actually fixing this. So just be aware of that. So I'm going to walk through the steps and then we'll look at the screens. So in receivables, what we do is we post all the sales and receivables transactions for the year. Notice the emphasis on sales and receivables. So your sales order processing transactions that we had referred to before with the sales order processing reference, and then receivables transactions, and that can include transaction entry, that can include cash receipts, etc. And then make a pre-year-end closing backup. Close the year, and then an optional step again is close the fiscal periods. And one thing that we'll show you a screen on also is in closing the tax year. And Receivables Management and Payables Management are at the same time. So I'll show you that window in just a little bit. And then once you're done doing that, you can make a post-year-end closing backup. Okay, so the actual process is simple. It's really about making sure that your transactions are ready and your data is ready and you have proper backups. So what we're going to see here is that amount since last closed view. So what you're going to see here is, and there's a drop down here, So amount since last close is one option. The other two options are fiscal year and calendar year. So if you guys are on a calendar year, then it's really a moot point. You could select calendar year, and that would be the same as fiscal. The amount since last close is important for the very fact that there are some summary numbers that do not zero out if you don't run your year-end close at the proper time. So then your numbers could be askew, and that's what we want to make sure that you're aware of. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But ultimately, the year-end closing process takes what's in this column and forces it over to this column. So these become zero. These numbers then transfer over to last year, and then the life-to-date numbers get updated as well. So anyway, just keep that in mind as you work through this. This is under Sales, Cards, Summary, and you can see the summary view here. That drop-down gives you the option. If you're not on a, if you're on a fiscal year or a calendar year, you can select the fiscal or calendar, and those numbers will adjust based upon that. All right, so notice down here at the bottom of this window there is a finance charge window or button, and we'll refer to that in just a minute. So if I click on that finance charge button, then what I do is I get a window that looks like this. And this window is specifically tracking finance charges. You can see the number of finance charges, the amount of those finance charges, and any of those finance charges were waived. And when you close your calendar year, those will move over here, okay? So sales, cards, summary, finance charges, okay? This is what the year-end window looks like, and like I said, if you're on a calendar year, then you can select all when it asks you what year to close. Otherwise, if I'm closing my year for 6/30, then I would pick fiscal, and then at the end of the calendar year, I would pick calendar. And the system will actually track my last closing date. Notice also that there's the ability here to print a report at the end of the closing process as well, if you'd like, and I do recommend that, as a matter of fact. Okay. Now let's go back to that whole amount since last closed issue. I know that we have a big audience, and I know that a lot of you use Smart Lists. Some of you may use Smart Lists for your customers and your vendors, and some of you may actually make decisions based upon prioritize your customers or your vendors based upon how much you buy from them or how much they buy from you. So I actually just pulled a Smart List together that was our basic customer one, and then I dropped in another field that is their total sales year to date. This number continues to grow until you do your year-end close. And so if you don't do your year-end close in time, these numbers will be wrong for the actual year because it overlaps. And so that's really what we're trying to address. So we have so what I would say is receivables, and you'll see this in payables too, is kind of date sensitive, but it's kind of not. And really when I say kind of not, I'm really referring to these numbers right here. And that's why when I referred to a script to be run to make sure your numbers get updated, there is actually a script that's available that if you did not close your year on time, you'll have a script that can be run that will correct them based upon the dates of the transactions. But on its own, those numbers are going to be incorrect if you don't close at the proper time, and then you post some additional transactions in the new year before you close. And then when you do close, it's going to zero it out, and therefore your numbers for the following year are going to be wrong as well. It's not a huge deal because a lot of times people report off a transaction detail instead, but if anyone is using these summarized numbers, they're not going to be correct unless you close at the proper time. And frankly, I think at that point it's a really good time to do it anyway, because it's kind of a time when you're really thinking about, hey, look, it's year end, let's get it done, and that way you can move on with your new year. All right. So that's receivables. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to move on into the Payables Management module. And so you're going to find that there's a lot of similarities between payables and receivables. There are a few differences, and I want to talk about those. But ultimately, in payables, the calendar year end close routine should be run at the end of the calendar year, like you'd expect, prior to posting any transactions. And the fiscal year end should be run at the end of the fiscal year. So this is really identical to what we were saying on the receivable side. There's a little bit of difference here in that the calendar year end close process transfers 1099 amount from the year-to-date column to the last year column in the amount since last close view. Okay. The fiscal year end close process transfers all other amounts. So you're going to have, billed to date by the vendor, the amount you've paid them to date, etc. There's a number of those types of things that are going to be in there. And the fiscal year closes everything out, zeroes everything out, except for the 1099 amount. Again, I'll just reference the fact that there are some scripts that can update the amount since last close view if you don't do that at the proper time. You can reach out to Socius to talk to us about how we can get those scripts and make sure they get run. All right, so then if we move into the payables checklist, we want to make sure that we post all the transactions for the year. We print the aged trial balance with options report. We print the vendor period analysis report, and really the vendor period analysis report is optional. Now this one may strike you as funny. Install the payroll year-end update. And so one of the things about the payroll year-end update is that it is a service pack. And so it may include updates that are beyond payroll. So as an example, if there were an update to the 1099 form, it could be included in the payroll year-end update. And so when you load that update, that service pack, it would then update your 1099 document so that those print out properly. You can make a backup that is named pre-1099 edits, and then verify that all the 1099 information, verify the 1099 information and edit if it was required. So you can print the 1099s, but you're not required to print the 1099s right at year end. You certainly have time beyond the year end process. And just like the receivable side, the payable side is partially date sensitive, so it handles the 1099s in a date sensitive fashion. It just doesn't handle that smart list year to date piece. And so just be aware of that. So we don't have to print the 1099s right at the end of the year. We do have some flexibility there. You can make a backup that is named pre-year end, and then make sure you make the backup and then close the year. One of the things I didn't say earlier was that typically the payables and receivables year ends, because they're really not moving data as much as they are just updating summary numbers, are typically not terribly time consuming. And in fact, with some of our clients may just take a minute or two. So this is not going to be something that is quite as time consuming as what we run into, for instance, with the general ledger that we'll talk to in just a bit. Okay, so once you close the year, then you can go back and close the fiscal periods for the purchasing series, close the tax year, and then make a backup that is named post year end. Okay, and so just that's the typical checklist that you would use to close the payables module. So I just want to kind of point out. Oh yeah, fire away.
Okay. How important is it to print vendor period analysis? What happens if we didn't print it?
Well, you won't. I don't think you can go back and reprint that report so if you use that report, then you should print it at the end of the year. If you're not using the report anyway, then it probably is less important. You still have access to all the detailed transactions, and so there are ways of getting that information. So I think it depends on how you use the system and what reports you use as to how important it is.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Mm-hmm. So this is the summary window for vendors, and you get to that going to purchasing, cards, summary, and yearly. There's a yearly button, and again, same concept, year to date, last year, life to date. And so the year to date numbers get transferred to last year, these get zeroed out, and then you move on. But you can see that the fiscal year will zero out the amount billed, it will do the amount paid, terms, discount available, these types of fields, finance charges, etc., will all be handled with the fiscal year end, and then the 1099 amount will get updated with the calendar year end close. Okay. This screen should look somewhat familiar. Same concept as what we were looking at before. You can close, if you're on a calendar year, you can close both at the same time. You have the option of printing a report, and also before you even go in, this should show you last year's date as the date that you've closed if you've been using the system beyond 1 year. Okay, then you simply click the close year button. Here's our smart list. Again, the amount billed year to date. I just created a smart list from the vendor smart list and then added the amount billed year to date. And so I just wanted to make sure that we point that out. Now, one of the things that has been in GP for the last couple revisions is the ability to edit 1099 information. So prior to printing your 1099s, you do have some flexibility. And so you do have the ability to edit these transactions. Okay, so notice that I have my voucher. We can drill into that voucher with the heading here. We see the document number, the invoice, and then you can see the 1099's amounts. So if there are cases where a transaction was not marked or a vendor was not marked early on as 1099 and you've changed them, then you have the ability to make updates to certain transactions. And this is something that you'd want to make sure is taken care of before you go into the year-end process. And then also you can update 1099 information here. So we can update a vendor or a range of vendors that we may have misset. So these two windows do give you some flexibility. These have been added. So if you're still on 2010, I don't believe this feature existed until GP 2013. Okay. And then this is the 1099 printing process. And you'll notice here that the system will ask you for the 1099 year. So this is the part of payables that is date sensitive. It's going to then allow you to produce those 1099s, and you can print the 1096 form at the end as well, which is more of the summarized total of the 1099s. So this is the window that you get to through purchasing routines and print 1099s, and allows you to actually produce those documents. Now, I don't really talk about this in the deck, in the slide deck here, but one thing I did want you to know is that there are add-on products. For instance, there's a company called Green Shades that actually has a product that will allow you to electronically file your 1099s. GP does not have that functionality right out of the box. Okay, so if that's something that's interesting to you, certainly we can look into that. Now this is just, I wanted to give you a quick look at the tax year end close. It is a single process, so this actually would follow your payables and receivables close, and you again can print a report on this. It zeroes out your tax year to date for the different tax details and schedules so that you have a good control of that. So that really ties in with your payables and receivables process. Okay. I'll pause for a minute. Cheryl, are there any additional questions?
Yes, it looks like there are. She's saying we're going to issue both 1099 Miss and 1099B. Will we be able to pull the correct data over for our 1099B forms?
I know that all of the data, there's miscellaneous, there's I'm sorry, I can't think of the other, I can't spit out the other names, but there are different 1099 forms that are available. So, but I'm not familiar, and maybe I should be, but the 1099B. So maybe if we can offline that, I'll do some research and get an answer for you on that.
Okay.
Unless you can elaborate a little more.
I'll make sure to save her information.
Okay.
There's been a lot of questions about the slide deck presentation being available afterwards. We are recording this presentation, so we'll be sending out the recording and a copy of the slide deck afterwards. And that's all for now, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. Okay, so now I'm going to head into the final stretch here. We have 3 more modules to go. So first of all, I want to talk about fixed assets. And so the checklist for fixed assets really is fairly brief, but the idea is that we want to perform all year-end closing procedures for payables prior to fixed assets. So I don't want to overemphasize, but I want you to understand that list for the modules that we close, that is a specific order that they should be closed, and you may not be using them all, but certainly try to follow that order as you close your modules. Okay. You want to enter all the fixed asset transactions for the current fiscal year. You want to depreciate all assets through the last day. I'll emphasize the last day of the current fiscal year. Perform the GL posting, and then run any year-end reports that you want to keep as part of the year-end financial reports. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You want to then make sure that your fixed asset calendar is built correctly. Verify that the quarters are set up correctly for all fiscal years. Create a backup, and then perform the year-end closing routine. Now, so for this, it's a pretty simple process. This is the asset year-end. We can do it for one or all books at the same time. So you just simply insert those into the selection and then click continue. So this is how you'll get to the year-end processing for the fixed asset module. So financial, routines, fixed assets, and year-end. All right.
We do have a question on receivables and payables.
Okay.
When you close the year-end in receivables and payables, does that clear out the year-to-date totals for SmartList as well, or is there a separate action to close out SmartList totals?
No. In fact, like I was saying before, I think it's really important to make sure you do that at the right time. It does zero out the year-to-date numbers. So when you do that year-end, it actually closes out the year-to-date. And that is the amount since last closed. So that's why it's important to make sure your timing is proper on that. So it's a one-step process. So when you do the year-end close, it should then zero out the numbers that you see in SmartList.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's talk a little bit about analytical accounting, and then we'll finish up with the general ledger, and then hopefully we'll have time if there are any additional questions as we go through. So there really is not a separate year-end close procedure for analytical accounting. There are balance brought forward entries are created for analytical accounting dimensions automatically as part of the year-end close process if you have the analytical accounting dimensions set up to have a balance brought forward entry created. And so we'll look at the screens and everything for analytical accounting. So people use analytical accounting, for those of you not aware, people use analytical accounting for a variety of things. They may use it to track, heck, it could be anything. It could be projects, or it could be it could be customer expenses, it could be grant information. There's all kinds of different things, and they can have different characteristics. And some of that you want the balances to carry forward, and others at the end of the year you want them zeroed out and start over. And so it's really important that you decide when you set up the dimensions that you have it set up in the proper way. So I'm going to show you the windows where that'll come into play. And so really, analytical accounting really rides on the back of general ledger. So it really is going to be based on the general ledger year end. So a couple setup windows that you got to keep in mind. So this is the first one. You'll notice that there's a checkbox on the analytical accounting options. It says include dimensions in the year-end close. So if that's not marked, then the year-end close has no effect on analytical accounting. To get to this window, you go to Administration, Setup, Company, Analytical Accounting, and Options. Okay? So keep that in mind. The second thing is when you actually set up your dimensions, there is a setting here for the year-end close that says Consolidate Balances during the year-end close. Okay, so keep that in mind as well. And that's really it. So you just want to make sure that those two windows are set up properly. So when you're setting up your dimensions, think about what the characteristics of those dimensions are and whether they need to be included in the year-end process, and if they are, do you consolidate the balances during the year-end close? All right, now we saved the biggest for the end, and the biggest actually is the general ledger. And the general ledger is the most unique module in regards to the requirements of timing and how they work together, how it works with the other modules. So always make the general ledger the final module to be closed, and it doesn't need to be closed immediately like the others. So a lot of those year-to-date numbers that we talked about, the question that was wrapped around Smart List, etc., that doesn't really play the same way in the general ledger. So just keep that in mind, but make the general ledger the last module. Now, there are a lot of unique things about the general ledger you need to know in regards to year-end close. So, in fact, before I go any further, let me just talk about the actual process. Then we'll come in and I'll show you some windows, and you'll see how this all comes into play. So, first of all, you want to complete the posting procedures and the closing procedures for all the other modules. You want to post your final adjusting entries in the general ledger, and I say that with the idea that in reality they don't all have to be posted, and I'll talk about why here in a little bit. The next thing that I'm going to recommend is that you then print an account list to verify the posting type of each account. For any of you that have set up general ledger accounts in your chart of accounts, you know that an account can be set up as a balance sheet account or as a profit and loss account. If it's set up as a balance sheet account, when you close your year, it rolls forward the balance in that account. If it's set up as a profit and loss account, then it actually zeroes that balance and sends it to retained earnings. So when you close your year, it's real easy if you're setting up accounts to set up a couple new accounts and maybe get in a hurry and not check to make sure that those accounts are set up properly. And then what you end up with is an account that when it closes is closed improperly and either rolls forward a balance or zeros to retained earnings, and then all of a sudden you got a little bit of a mess that there are ways of reversing out, but you want to, it's just better if you make sure you check this before you get into a little bit of a hassle. So then you can close the last period of the fiscal year. Now, optionally, you can perform file maintenance on the financial series group of modules, and that actually is like check links. There's a function to do that. I wouldn't say that that's certainly not required. It's something that actually you could run on any of the different module groups, but that's included in the checklist. All right, so you want to verify the settings in the General Ledger Setup window, and I'm going to show you that window, and this is all about how if you allow posting to history as an example. You know, there's a number of different questions, and I'll show you the screen where we can talk about that. Make a backup. We recommend that you print a final detailed trial balance report. Print your year-end financial statements. Most of you are probably using Management Reporter to do that, but certainly make sure that you get those printed. Make sure at this point you should already have your fiscal year set up, but make sure your new fiscal year is set up, and then close the year. And then lastly, you can close all the fiscal periods for that series. Then adjust the budget figures for the new year, and then print the financial statements. And then lastly, make a backup. Okay, so let's dig into some of these windows. So first of all, you'll notice that in the year-end closing window, there is a retained earnings account. So for all of your profit and loss accounts, you're making a determination as to what retained earnings account it goes to. Now, we do have the ability to set that up so that it goes like to divisional retained earnings accounts if you divide your balance sheet out that way, so that division 100 goes to retained earnings 100, etc. But you can just set it up to go to one retained earnings account based upon how you set up your balance sheet. The system then will have the next available journal entry number. A couple things that I wanted to make sure that you were aware of is, first of all, in GP 2015, there is a new function that allows you to reverse a historical year. In other words, reopen a year. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying you need to do it, but you could. Also, do you want to maintain inactive accounts? So the system does have the ability to remove inactive accounts, so you have the ability to maintain inactive accounts, all inactive accounts, or inactive accounts with budget amounts. Okay, so, and the last thing, I have this big rectangle wrapped around and you're thinking there's nothing in it. Well, until recently, we've had problems with people who have a lot of data, they're running their year-end close, and it takes a while, and they think that the system is locked up. So now what Microsoft has added is a progress bar here. You can't see it here because I'm not running the process, but it certainly eliminates some stress that people have thinking that maybe their year-end has stopped when it really hasn't. And also we've had people reboot in the middle of a year-end close, and that leads to having to restore backups and go through the process again. So it's really more of an indicator to you as to where the process resides at that time. So this is the GL setup window I was talking about. Oops, let's go back here. So notice there we do have the closed to divisional accounts, or we can just make it a single account. Also, there's some settings here around accounts, transactions, and budget transactions. So do we maintain that history? I think the answer to that should normally be yes. Also, then there's an option here to allow posting to history. And I wanted to make sure that you are aware of that, because that is going to be very, very important. Because if we allow posting to history, we can close our year, and then without reopening the year, I have the ability to post a transaction to a closed year, the most recently closed year. So if I close 2015 and then in March I get an additional audited adjustment entry, I can enter that and it will roll forward the balances or update the retained earnings account appropriately when I enter that transaction. So that is a setting that can be turned on and off. The other thing I wanted to make sure you're aware of, especially if you're new with GP, is your balances do not roll forward for a balance sheet until you've closed your year. And so with that being said, some people like to close the year so they can at least get preliminary balance sheets, and then they'll just enter those adjustments as they get those from their auditor or from anything that you run across that you know you need to update. So keep that in mind. These settings are very, very important. And so this is the smart list I was referring to that you might want to create, where you can see your chart of accounts, the account description and number, and then the posting type. If you accidentally set up a cash account in this example as profit and loss, it would stick out like a sore thumb, and we want to make sure that you're paying attention to that. So just to be safe, if you want to print a smart list like this, it's out of the box, then you can actually see whether anything is set up improperly. So with that, I think I have covered all of the modules that I had hoped to cover, and we still have a couple minutes left, so Cheryl, I'll let you take over from here.
Great. We do have a few questions in here that need addressed, so I'll go ahead and start asking those. Is there a project accounting year-end process?
No.
Okay. Do we have to close AP module, then FA? If we don't have any addition or disposal on FA on the last month of the year, can we close FA module, then AP, or do we need to follow those order?
I think that you just, I think it's best to close payables first.
If we are still entering AP after year end, I assume we can keep the AP module open until all 2015 invoices are entered and then close. Do we need to wait on the process payments in 2016 until 2015 is closed, or will the posting date drive the year?
From a general ledger perspective, your posting date does drive what period it posts to. So if you're entering transactions in January, it will drive to the proper accounting period. So your GL will be proper. What won't be proper is if you've have in the midst of all of that, you're entering December transactions and you're also entering January transactions. They're both going to be included in your year-to-date numbers when you post them. So that smart list view will be wrong.
How do I set up a new fiscal year? I don't see the ability to create a new fiscal year.
That actually was what we covered right at the beginning, so you may have missed it. Let me get back to it. The fiscal years get defined. Sorry, hang with me. I'm almost there. I had more slides than I knew, Cheryl. There we go. Fiscal years get set up in this window. So this is what you go into in the bottom where you have the bars that say home, financial, sales, etc. You select administration, go to setup, go to company, and then fiscal periods. And at that point, then you can go in, put in your new year, put in the number of periods, put in the beginning and end date, and then hit calculate, and it'll create the year for you. Any year that's been closed will also be designated with a check mark next to historical year.
If we close all the module except GL module, can we open the new year period and make the transaction for the new year?
Yes. Yeah, that's the power of that's the power. You can create these new fiscal periods, even though GL may not have closed. You can even post journal entries into the new fiscal year. And as long as then when you close, you're going to close the particular year that's appropriate, it will not bother with anything that's in the newer year.
See, if the purchasing module needs to be closed right away, do we not need to roll the GL as well in order for the January transactions to be recorded in January? As long as the posting to history setting is turned on, we should still be able to continue through the year and close and audit on the GL, correct?
Yes, that posting to GL works from not just journal entries, but from the subledgers as well.
Can we cut check?
Again, I was going to say, again, the only issue is going to be the payables year-to-date amount that shows up in SmartList is going to be amount since last close. So if you don't close payables at the end of the year, then it's going to continue to grow that number, and then when you close, it's going to take what could be new year information into that. So it's all about timing. There are scripts that can fix that, so I don't want to overemphasize the importance of that. You can leave your new year open. You can continue to enter transactions into January as an example. And not everybody even uses that number in SmartList. And if it's wrong, you still have the ability to fix it. It's just an extra step if you have to fix it.
Okay. Can we cut checks even though GL is not closed for the year, but all the module already closed?
Yes. And you can as long as the other modules are closed appropriately, you can do whatever you want in those subledger modules. The GL can stay open because you can have multiple open years in the general ledger, even if you've closed all the subledgers.
Jeff, can you advance to that last slide for me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Almost there. There we go.
All right, thank you.
Oh my. Hang on, let me just get you there.
You're just about there.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
All right, as we wait for some more questions to come in, we wanted to remind you that upcoming events and promotions can be found on our site at socius1.com. Our 2016 GP webinar schedule has not yet been posted, but we have some exciting things in the pipeline, and we'll certainly share that with you soon once we have those on the calendar. And we also wanted to remind you that Microsoft will be increasing additional user pricing on January 1st. This affects those of you on GP module-based licensing and business-ready licensing. So if you're thinking you'll need to purchase additional users, you'll want to do that before the first of the year. Additional promotions on our site, $1,000 off you on SmartList Builder, 10% off Professional Advantage Company Data Archive, and 20% off a new Green Shades purchase. So if you are interested, you can see our site at socius1.com under Resources and Promotional Offers. On your screen now, you'll see Jeff's direct contact information. So we will be sending out a copy of the slide deck and a recording, as well as posting it to our site. So if you do have any questions afterwards, you can certainly feel free to share that presentation recording and deck with other members on your team if they were unable to make it today. Or you can simply reach out to Jeff directly to his email or phone number.